It just doesn't show very well on that. Evaluation, you're the last one. Okay.
All right, Dr. Miller, if you'll put that mic on, we're going to start right now. We already started the camera rolling. All right. Ms. High, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Mr. Smith?
Here.
Mr. Donahue?
Here.
Mr. Nicholas? Dr. Miller?
Here.
Mr. Shanks?
Here.
Mr. Gilstrap?
Here. All right, Jason, are you going to handle this portion? We're going to now have responses to the questions that were raised in our first meeting, the last meeting we had.
All right, good afternoon. Just want to follow up to some of the questions that we had from the last meeting. I want to direct your attention to the, due to some of the way it presents itself on the projector, we're going to just work off the handout information. Anybody needs handout information, we have handout information, but direct your attention to the electric customers by kilowatt hour by jurisdiction handout that we gave you. Just want to point out a few items from this illustration. Kilowatt hours were over 500,000 in 2011, but are pretty consistent over a 5-year time frame. We used fiscal years for the past 5 years. As you can see, our customer count has also remained pretty consistent for residential. Flip to the next page, commercial. Around 280,000 kilowatt hours sold. Our customer count, as you can see, is pretty flat as well. Most of our commercial customers being in the city of Danville. Flip over to industrial and municipal customers. Same story here. 178,000, 180,000 is about the average. Most of our industrial customers being in the city, municipal customers mostly being city of Danville facilities. And then on the last page, there's a list of our lighting customers. As you can see, in 2011, we did a lighting survey and increased our count from around 4,300 to roughly 6,200. And our street lights are pretty flat as well.
I'm sorry, what was the first column?
Outside lighting.
Outdoor lighting.
So our customer base is pretty flat. We were over 1 billion kilowatt hours sold in 2011. We had some higher degree days in that year, but overall we're just below a billion kilowatt hours sold each year.
About a billion, you said? 1 billion?
1 billion. Yes, sir.
That last page, I'm not tracking yet. ODL and street lights. So I'm confused about street lights because I know we have more than 37.
Right, those are street light controllers.
Well,
Street light controllers that we, VDOT pays for. VDOT helps pay the Public Works. It's funded through the Public Works Department. But those are actually street light controllers that we charge for. It's not the actual number of streetlights we have in the city of Danville.
Okay, what are the outdoor lights then?
Outdoor lights are lights that customers purchase to have on the side,
Like dawn, dusk to dawn light
like
type?
dusk to dawn lights.
Okay.
The municipal, the municipal on page 3, that is the number of meters, the number of customer accounts they are that charge the various city entities.
That's right.
So that's really not telling you anything other than that's just how it's billed.
Right.
That's just bookkeeped.
Right.
Okay.
What municipal facilities do we have in Pennsylvania County?
Schools would be,
No.
you know, what I'm talking about?
Probably substations and pumps.
That's right. City substations and maybe some pumping stations for our water.
For water,
Yeah,
perhaps sewer.
possibly.
One other quick question. On the commercial, page 2, maybe there's a typo. There seems to be an increase of 400 customers in Pittsylvania County between 2011 and 2012.
That's possibly from the time that we went from bi-monthly billing to monthly billing.
Okay.
So that's a reflection probably from that. The revenue stays the same.
Okay.
What's that got to do with bi-monthly billing? It's not, that doesn't
It's
change
it's
the
a
number of
customer,
customers.
he's referring to the customer account number, and it's the number of bills that we send out. I think it's the how the report was driven.
But that's not the number of bills you send out, it's the number of customers you have, the number of accounts you have.
Yeah, that probably doesn't explain it unless customers decided to split meters or something like that.
Right. Look, we can dig into that.
Can you take
Just
another look at that?
Because you didn't see a corresponding increase in your residential.
And we didn't see 400 customers, commercial customers in the year either. So we can dig into that, see what the difference is.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any question on this particular shift of information?
Moving on.
So, just to summarize, in the last 5 years, we've seen no significant drop in customers.
Our customer base has been flat, kilowatt hours.
Right.
Has been pretty consistent.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, the reason why I asked this specific question was I wanted to get a feeling for if in fact we have had. In the city of Danville, we've got blight issues, and I wanted to see how that was impacting upon actual sales by the electric utility. And I appreciate you getting that information.
Sure. Next document I want to refer your attention to is the one that's labeled Utilities Department.
Sorry, before we move from these 4 pages, I haven't done the math, do the columns, if you go all from left to right, right up to the final on the last page, is that what that is? Okay.
The last page is your total summary, that last column there.
That's the total going this way. All right.
So interpreting this, in residential, there are approximately 5,000 fewer customers, but they use 10,000 more kilowatt.
On residential? What year?
In 2014, Pennsylvania County used more kilowatts, but with fewer customers.
Pennsylvania County in 2014 had 15,596 customers.
Right.
And in 2010, they had 15,805.
No, I'm talking about in the same year.
Okay,
Danville has 20,490 customers.
Right.
The county is 15,596.
see
Even though the county has fewer number of customers, they're using more electricity.
that's correct.
Is that perhaps due to the
housing.
Preponderance of apartments and lease units in the city versus residential homes in the county? Something like that.
Again, I'm assuming it could be
Speculating.
the size of homes in Pittsylvania County compared to the city of Dayton.
Yeah.
Any other questions about this one?
Yes, the question that just came up before this begs the question, the energy efficiency program that the city has applies to all Danville Power customers.
That's correct.
Got my check this year.
Okay. The next document, we were asked to do a study on the transmission charges in relation to how we were charged in January from the polar vortex. If you flip over. Transmission charges are charged based on three components. There's a demand, energy, and a direct charge. And let me explain a little bit about each of these three charges. Demand is based on your highest peak of your previous year. So last year we peaked at roughly 205 megawatts. So that 205 megawatts is multiplied times a fixed rate each month, and that rate varies. So that's how they figure our demand charge for transmission. Energy charge is charged by PJM, the regional transmission operator for our region. It's a pass-through based on our load. It varies from, it does not vary month to month very much, but it is based on our usage more or less. And direct transmission charges are charged it's a pass-through charge from AEP, since they're our end transmission provider for metering and other ancillary charges. And in the graph you see at the bottom of the page, you can see that our transmission charges did peak over in January because of the polar vortex, and but have remained consistent around $700,000 per month. But in the month of January, they just tipped over $1 million. In March of that year, we did March was, as you can see, was elevated. That was due to adjustment from PJM because of some charges from January. So
those were January charges also that weren't booked in January?
More January charges that were incurred in March's cost. Yes, sir.
The direct charge that Appalachian charges for pass-through, how come you don't see that every month? Or is it just not clear?
The direct transmission charge, we do see that every month.
It just doesn't show up clearly on this graph?
It's so small.
So when you don't see it, it's even smaller. It's not
It's not a
it's
very
not a
large
consistent
charge.
number.
Right.
Well, that begs the question, if it's not a consistent number, wouldn't it be larger during, say, January 14, when we had the polar vortex?
I think it's a rather.
It's not related?
I think it's a rather flat cost because it's for metering and other ancillary charges. It's not based on demand or energy like the other two charges are. It's based on services like metering and items like those. So it's I think more of a fixed cost than it is based on usage.
Okay.
Okay. Just for my edification, what's a spinning reserve?
Good question.
Could you repeat that, please?
Spinning reserve
Okay.
under energy charge.
It is a charge by PJM, but I don't have a proper definition for that. Let me follow up with that and get a proper definition for spinning. But it is a charge that PJM bills us for every month.
These transmission charges do not include the problem we had last January with congestion charges.
Those are two different.
Two different things.
Totally
Can you
separate.
explain the difference between the two?
I was going to get to that here
Okay,
in just a second.
okay, fine, then.
But I'll go ahead and answer
I
your
don't want
question.
to, I don't want to get you out of order. I just want to make sure we were going to get to that. That's fine.
Okay. If you flip over to the next page, the back page of this,
Look at the back of this.
you can see our cost for January per megawatt hour based on our resources that we have available. Our blended rate is roughly $84 a megawatt hour. Because of the polar vortex, our cost went to $124.25 per megawatt hour. And that's because of the lack of generation in PJM. PJM, and let me remind you from my presentation from last meeting, PJM's main responsibility is to economically meet the generation for the load. And during the times in January, it was just about having generation for the load, regardless of economics. So, because of various reasons. One was being shortage in natural gas supply, coal plants being out of commission, natural gas being out of commission. So I'll go into that a little bit further in a minute, but in January, our average cost was, a good bit more than the average blended rate. Yes, sir.
Okay, you're talking about the 124, 25 megawatt.
Yeah, that
per
pie
meg-
chart.
Okay, you mentioned the first number that I'm not seeing, that is our regular average cost, 84 or something?
Our average blended cost is $84. I don't have it listed on this paper.
Average blended, and that's just what we have contracted.
What we have contracted with our different projects. And then this is what we incurred in January.
And
that's
that was
our-
84, what? 84 what?
$84
Even?
per megawatt hour.
And that's just our cost for power, not including the transmission
No, this
cost.
doesn't include transmission.
Oh, it does include, this includes, does 84
Yes.
include the transmission? It does. Okay.
Include congestion,
Yes.
includes everything.
This is everything,
Air dock,
everything.
all in.
To our meter, to our,
Well,
as you can see in this pie chart, 30% of the power came from Prairie State, 10% from Fremont, the natural gas plant in northwest Ohio. We have a couple strips from Morgan Stanley, some small strips. A large portion of it came from a block of power that expires in 2016 from AEP. And then 17% of it is what they call pool or market. We had to buy off the market. And let me explain how that works. You have on-peak and off-peak power, and you charge a premium for on-peak power. And during January, like I said, PJM's responsibility is to meet load based on economic generation. And when generation, in this case, it wasn't available, it was just about meeting the need at that point.
So in this chart, the congestion charges are represented by the pool?
No,
Portion of
pool is the representation of what we had to buy off the market.
Okay.
Congestion charges are wrapped into the, each
Each component
different
has
slice
it
had
rolled in?
congestion.
Okay, thank you.
and the pool is the spot price right now, right that
The
second.
pool you could label as market power.
That's what, that's
Okay,
right
thank
there.
you.
How many hours, how many days do you know, did we have to pay this price? What does that 124.25 represent in number of hours in time units of the month of January?
I had to
Do
go
you
back.
know?
It's from the 1st through the 31st. That's what that was averaged upon.
So this was the average price of all the
January.
minutes of all the days in January. Do you know what the high price was?
I don't know.
How, do you have that data available?
I can get it.
Can you go to the minute, to the 5 minutes? What's the breakdown that you would get?
The way, let me talk a little bit about
Yeah,
how they purchase power.
okay, do that.
The gas supply and electric power work hand in hand. They forecast for the next day, and In Fremont's case, they have to maintain that they have firm gas for the next day at a certain price. And in some cases, they didn't have firm gas. So the price of gas rose because Fremont needed to run. So the price of Fremont power escalated compared to what was forecasted. So, but if you wanted forecasted power, forecasted rates, is that what you're asking for?
No, I wanted you to sort of talk about what does this number mean? And what does it represent?
The 124.25?
Yeah, and it represents all the power that was bought for the month of January.
The average cost.
But to say that was the average of 124 is one thing. I was sort of getting at what the highest price was.
Okay.
I was trying to kind of get a description
You wanna know
of
what that top
what
peak
a
is.
one-off deal this was. This was a very unusual situation because of the extreme weather and the inability of the generators with the gas problem to create enough power. And that's why the price skyrocketed.
Right.
And the congestion charges were so high because demand was so high in so many different geographical areas, or at least in the Northeast and in the Midwest.
And let me emphasize here that we're not the only utility that experienced this issue. Anybody that didn't have generation on their territory had experienced this issue with congestion. Other municipalities, other utilities, unless you had generation at your doorstep, then you experience these rates. So it's just not Danville Utilities.
And the congestion, which I believe was 4.8 million for
That's right.
Danville for 1 month. Can you talk to us about how that number got calculated?
It got calculated by the sum of all these different strips and projects. So if you had a congestion charge for each of these different Prairie State, Fremont, the AEP, the Morgan Stanley, if you add up all the congestion for each of them, that's where you get the 4.8.
So the transmission charges were about $1 million, a little over $1 million per the first chart.
Right,
And the congestion charges were 4.8 million.
right.
Now I'm going to ask you a man on the street question. Do you mean to tell me that you could get all the power you needed here for $1 million from wherever it came from, for $1 million, and somebody turned around and charged you $4.8 million on top of that? How is that possible?
That's PJM's cost. I mean, that's a pass-through. That's not what AMP charged us.
Well, who is PJM?
PJM is the regional transmission operator for our region for the Northeast.
And they have the power to do this?
They do.
They have the authority. Did they get their authority from the government?
They do. And we sent representation to Washington in the spring to challenge why did we have this issue? Why weren't we given notice? And we're still waiting on more feedback, more input on why we experienced this and why can't we have more insight on future events.
But is it fair to say that PJM had to go out on the spot market on behalf of its customers to be able to make up for a shortfall in electric requirements?
They have to forecast for the day ahead. And when you pay a capacity charge, you're paying for that amount of power to be reserved. And when that power is not reserved, then there's a problem.
There's a problem.
And that's what we ran into. Go ahead.
Okay, PJM charged 4.8 million, and that is a regional entity. Are Fremont and Prairie State within PJM?
Fremont is.
That's where the money went.
Prairie State is in Midwest ISO.
Midwest? And did we get congestion charges from them also?
No. We incur a separate transmission charge to get Prairie State to the AEP Dayton hub.
So as far as the congestion charges, we didn't pay since we were outside of the PJM?
Let me back up and explain that a little bit better. We incur a transmission congestion charge to get that power that we share with the members of AMP from Prairie State to the AEP Dayton hub.
Right.
So that number that number was blended in with PJM's, or that's another number other than the 4.8?
That's blended in with this 30% cost.
Where does it stand with regard to the 4.8 million? Million that was charged by PJM to us in
I
January?
think it would be better if I give a breakdown of that $4.8 million.
Okay.
Because I think you're trying to wrap the $4.8 million into this 124.25 cost.
Good idea.
Yeah. Carry on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
There's a question about natural gas. Was there a shortage of natural gas to begin with, supplying, or was it the shortage caused by the bad weather? I mean, would there have been a problem even if the weather hadn't been bad? Did they not have enough natural gas?
A little bit of both, and I have a slide showing that.
Okay.
I'm about 2 slides away from that, but I'll answer your question. The next slide I have here just shows the monthly energy totals, a little bit about what I've already described before. It shows our peaks and valleys of each month. As you can see, we peaked at, in January this year, we peaked at 230 megawatts. So again, our demand charge next year won't be 205 megawatts, it'll be 230, because we peak, that charge is set by AEP's 1CP, which is their coincidence peak. And it's charged at a fixed rate. So our demand charge would be set by our highest peak time, which is also AEP's peak time. But we've had a fairly decent summer.
Jason, I'm sorry. I'm not quite up to speed. The 230 megawatts you just noted as our peak in January.
Is our peak for the year. Actually.
Right. But what is the 110? That's megawatt hours on the chart that we're looking at.
110,000 megawatt hours. This year we're just below that for the year in January.
If I could ask a question back on the demand charge again.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding that that is going to be our peak for the year,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're going to have an adjustment. Is that adjustment made on absolute value, or is it made on a percentage of the load that the system had to handle in that particular month?
How is that charge going to be fixed for next year?
Right.
That charge is based on the AP's 1CP.
Okay.
So that 230 megawatts sets our
So
price
it is,
for next year.
it is an absolute, it's an absolutely relative
It sets it for the next
comparison.
12 months.
Okay.
So instead of 205, we'll be at 230. So it will raise our costs a little bit. So anytime
So we would
can peak
expect about a 10% increase in that demand charge,
on transmission
perhaps.
charges. Yeah.
Okay. Not the energy, just the demand charge component of the transmission cost.
Right.
Thank you.
Is the decision to make that previous year peak, the demand for the following year, is that a best management practices, or is that a rule, a requirement by the government? What is that?
That's a rule by PJM.
I mean, in other words, if everyone agreed that that may have been an outlier, it still doesn't matter, that's what our demand's going to be.
Yeah, we don't have any input or say-so on that. That's a rule set by PJM. I just want to highlight, if you look at the second pie chart that's labeled PJM installed capacity by fuel. As you can see, PJM, their resources is 41% coal, and that's a little alarming because in the second chart, or the second graph here, a lot of their coal resources are going to be retiring. In fact, they have 10,000 megawatts, retiring in just 2015. So that energy has to be replaced by something. 10% of 160,000 is significant in 1 year. So again, this drives our need to find more behind-the-meter generation for Danville.
So if we look at the projected retirements 2011 through 2019, that's how much total?
I don't have a total on here. It's just a chart of PJM's territory, and it shows you where the different retirements are and based on what type of fuel they are.
It would be interesting to know, I know you don't want more questions based upon questions.
But I did see 10,000 megawatts of resources will be retired in 2015.
Okay. But if we think about, as we go through this process, it's going to be probably pretty important for us to understand how much capacity is being retired versus how much capacity is currently being planned to add into the system. So if we were able to get that information, that would be pretty beneficial as we look at options for this utility.
Over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think you've got this 2011 through 2019 timeframe is probably pretty good. So if it was possible to sum all up what the retirements are versus the total load.
Okay.
And also what retirements are early retirements due to regulation.
Right. And then what's on the books for additions?
What you're trying to determine there is the potential for congestion.
Well, potential for congestion, but also the potential for needing to import outside of the PJM interconnect area. Is there going to, because if we're going to be if we're going to see supply continue to be reduced versus demand, the net effect is our potential prices will go up because of scarcity. Now, if that's the case, then perhaps as we look through options such as an investment in generating capacity, it might have some higher return. So understanding that demand versus capacity, I think, would be very helpful for us in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
It's important for us to have some idea of the locations of this generation.
Yeah.
For planning in the future, for several reasons. But I mean, some of it's pretty obvious.
What's your question again?
Location.
When you're asking, the location is important when you're giving us this information about where the generation is, what's planned to go off, what's planned to come on.
Okay.
The location's important too, of where it is.
So for instance, Joe, if we're in a position where we see that demand versus capacity, mismatch, but we also see that there's really not a lot of activity going on in transmission, back to your point, well, then we ought to be taking that back to the Public Service Commission. Because if you think about it, we're the ones who are going to get hammered on congestion, not the AEPs, right?
Yeah.
It becomes an opportunistic revenue stream for them.
Right. It's a pass-through to us.
And the Public Service Commission, even though, that is a venue where we can advocate for our position as an independent, perhaps, because we have no control over that outside of our own generation, if we choose to do it. Thank you. This was a good figure. I'm glad you brought that up.
Jason, can I ask, in the legend on that figure 12-1, the white circles are coal plants that are going offline after this year?
That's correct.
There are a lot of them.
Yeah.
Got natural gas units going out too.
Yeah. Why is that?
Probably due to the types of motors that they're running. They have lifespans. They're usually 25 to 30 year lifespans, and if they go past that, then you can't find parts for them, and you just have to retire them or replace them.
So they're not going to replace the natural gas plants?
Well, my guess is they're probably going to either upgrade them or replace them. They just don't have them marked on here.
And that's why we need that information.
Right.
What are they going to replace? What are they going to upgrade? Great question.
The supply is there. It's permitted. I imagine that they'll keep running.
Good job.
Back to your question, Dr. Miller, on the back page here, this last circle chart. On January 7th, PJM ran into a problem with supply and generation for the region because of the shortage in gas supply, the outages from both coal and natural gas plants. They were short 40,000 megawatts of total system capacity of 160,000. So that's a fourth of their system that they didn't have generation for. And it became very serious that they almost had to run rolling blackouts because of generation resources that they just didn't have. A lot of these natural gas plants didn't have firm supply, more or less. They had interruptible gas.
Cheaper, but
Cheaper.
interruptible.
Right.
Right.
So they decided to interrupt or shut down altogether. But this was a very serious time early in January for the entire region.
Sort of a perfect storm then, it hit it.
Right. You could say that. Which also drove the cost of power
So,
higher than we've seen before.
we talked a lot about PJM, and I'm sure you explained it before, but is PJM a government entity, a private sector entity, or is it a quasi-governmental entity?
After deregulation, they were formed to forecast and dispatch generation assets before
They were,
each
and they were
utility,
given this charge by whom?
the federal government,
Federal government.
FERC.
by FERC. Any other questions for me? We have some more information for you that you asked at the last meeting that I didn't bring for you, the operation and maintenance financial information that I'll bring to you at the next meeting. So I apologize for that.
Were you including a comparison of our rates to other rates?
I can bring that as well. I have that information readily available.
Now, that's what you have for us that was unfinished from previous meeting. This is questions from previous meeting.
That's everything minus the operation and maintenance by year, showing purchase power, production from hydro, our cost by work group, by transmission, distribution, meter, and things like that. And I'll bring that back in next meeting. I didn't have it with me today.
Do anybody have anything else?
No, just when you come back with the comparisons, include other municipal owned utilities.
That study does have, it has Richlands, Bedford, Salem, several cooperatives, AEP, so it was done by...
And private.
And private, yeah.
Does it include Dominion?
We do have Dominion's rates. Dominion sells power to some of the cooperatives to our east, so we also have that. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chase. We're going to have an explanation now. This is new business today, new information. Explanation of general fund transfers, administrative fees, and special project support payments.
I'm going to go over that.
Mr. King.
All right. The first document I want you to look at is labeled Utility Fund Transfers to the General Fund. It's all of one page and a part of a second.
I'm sorry, I don't have it.
Which one is it?
Third page in the stack.
Oh,
Okay.
this one? Okay.
Yep.
Got it. General fund administrative.
This is third page.
What I'm going to provide you is just describing what we currently do and the thinking behind it. Like anything else, this is a matter of policy and practice. And any utility may do it slightly different than we do. So everybody got the same document, it's, Fred, are you all right?
One of us has his others.
There's a bunch of extras.
We're short one over here.
We'll borrow one.
No,
Here you go. That's it. Which take this?
We're good.
Looking at the transfers first, the city's enterprise funds all transfer a certain portion of their income to the general fund. And in doing so, the intent there for all electric, gas, water, wastewater, and telecommunications is to provide what would have been paid in taxes and return on equity to the shareholders. This was established, this has actually been in practice for many years. It was revisited in 2005 and established as a city council policy at that time. And over the years, if you look back over 20 years, you'll see that from time to time, the water wastewater fund transfers were discontinued and those were reestablished in 2005. I would say that that's unusual for local governments. Nearly every local government that has an electric operation has some transfer to the general fund. Very few local governments appear to have water and wastewater transfers as well. And all of our utility enterprises have transfers. What we're focusing on today is the electric utility transfer. And the policy established in 2005 was that transfers would be between 10 and 15%. And again, that was meant to be roughly equivalent to what the taxes paid and the return on equity would be, with the taxpayers of Danville being the owners of the system. And as you can see, the last 5 years of actual, I think 2014 is projected, but 4 years of actual in 2014 shows that for the electric fund transfers, they ranged between 8 and 8.9% of revenues. The American Public Power Association does regular surveys of its members, and they indicate that 80% have some transfer to their local governments. And of the 210 utilities, that's 10% of their membership. There are about 2,000 utilities that responded to them. The typical median, that is half above, half below, for those surveyed was 5.5%. And they reported that by size of utility and by location. Electric utilities of Danville's size reported 6.4% of revenues, and the rate for those utilities in the Atlantic Coast area was 7%. So were this AEP here or Dominion, the utility would be paying a variety of taxes, including real and personal property tax, gross receipts, sales, use taxes, and franchise fees. The APPA reports that investor-owned utilities pay a median amount of 4.2% of their operating revenues to fees and taxes. That's to both local and state. They don't break that out. Looking at return on equity, American Electric Power reported to its shareholders that it earned 14.2% in 2013, and Duke reported 13% for that year. So you can see that combining the equivalent taxes and the return on investment, that Danville is well within the range intended, that this transfer reflect taxes and return on equity. This, of course, benefits the general fund significantly. Danville has one of the lowest tax rates in the state of Virginia. Of the 39 cities, ours is 5th lowest at 73 cents per $100 of assessed value. And one of the things that the city council will have to deal with if the transfer is adjusted is how to make that up. So if you reduce the transfer, we either reduce operation costs or we find additional revenue. And just to keep it simple, the transfer from the electric fund represented 45 cents worth of property tax revenue. And so that would have required raising the tax rate from 73 cents to $1.18. And the next thing I want to talk about are the cost allocations. There are $2 million of cost allocations, and were that not available, and we couldn't reduce the operating costs of the general fund. And there are certainly places where you could expect that would be true, like in collections. If we did away with our electric operation, presumably we could reduce our collections costs. But if you just assume we'd have to make that difference up, that would be another 9 cents on the tax rate. That would result in a real property tax rate of $1.27. So significant revenues.
Joe, of
Questions?
those four that have lower tax rates in the city of Danville, any of those own their own utilities, or do you know?
No.
None of them do.
Mostly those are tourist-based economies. Williamsburg, for example, has a lower tax rate. You can imagine that they have a significant sales tax, amusement tax.
And lodging.
Covington, very small
there last
city,
week.
has a lower rate than we do. Harrisonburg is one example that does have its own utility. I don't know what their transfer is. Fred?
The transfers have consistently been in the 8.5% to 9% range, and in 2013 it was 9.7%. My question is, the top column is sales, and then we have this number that's a transfer, but beyond sales, there's always something else that is transferred to unreserved fund from the previous year to the next.
Right.
Is that number something that should be part of this list?
I'm going to go over those.
You do have those? Okay.
I'm going to go over those next.
Okay.
This represents...
Oh, I'm not talking about administrative costs. I'm talking about transfers at the end of the year from the electric
special
fund.
projects.
No.
For special projects. The only three ways that money is transferred from the electric fund to the general...
I'm not talking about general fund. I'm talking about,
Fund
we have the electric fund at the end of the year generally has something in the lines of a surplus beyond the 9.7% in 2013. There was another number there that was transferred to fund balance, was it
All right,
not?
that stays in the electric fund balance.
Right, but that number, wouldn't that number on an annual basis be useful information with regard to this chart we just went over?
But it was staying in the utility fund.
It stays in the...
It's
in the-
utility fund balance.
It
not
stays in
general
the
fund
electric fund balance, that's correct.
That's right, it's general, utility
We-
fund balance, but there is a number there that sometimes it's bigger than other times. In other words, there's a number that's transferred out of the end of the year electric fund to go into electric fund balance.
That's correct.
That's the number I'm curious about.
We can produce that in great detail, and you have different categories of fund balance. So we can produce that. We'll get that at the next
Thank
meeting.
you.
That has no bearing on the transfers to the general fund, though.
Well, if we're consistently high on a surplus, and I don't remember, I see it every year what it is, I don't remember what it is, but if we're consistently high on that number, that should be a number that we should be thinking about with regard to rates and this whole concept of transfers, in my opinion.
Well, if it's accumulated over the years of fund balance, then there is a figure we have on our report each month of the fund balance.
The unrestricted fund balance.
Unrestricted
is what
fund
it's
balance.
called.
Right.
That's what has been accumulated over the years. Is that correct?
Right.
And that number should accumulate, but my question, there are some years that, I mean, we should understand that number. That's all my
Yes.
point was.
Fred, are you, if I could ask just a question, I think when there's a comparison made to a total return on investment, part of our return on investment is our, let's call it profit at the end of the year that goes into the fund balance.
And the fund balance, right.
So if we're going to make an apples-to-apples comparison of total return on investment for an IOU to the total return on investment for Danville Electric Utility, we would need to understand what that average transfer to the unrestricted fund balance is at the end of each year.
Thank you. That's,
We can provide that.
Now, the only thing that I would say is the comparison then at that point, though, would not be this total return on investment for the IOU, because that's an after-tax number. It would be the pre-tax number, because these folks are getting charged a pretty hefty amount for their taxes. And here you've got property taxes, gross receipt taxes, sales and use taxes, but there's also an income tax. So we would have to add the income tax back into this number, which would probably boost this close to 20% for an IOU.
Yeah, I'm not looking at, are you talking about corporate income tax?
Yeah. So again, if we're going to try to compare an apple to apple, which is I think what Fred wants us to do, and I think that's a great question, we want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So it would be the total return of the IOU, the enterprise, pre-income tax. And I know that's a little difficult, but once you start doing that
think-
comparison, you want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
I think it's important to know that the idea or theory is that these transfers should equate to taxes and return on equity. It's not a precise
No.
measurement. What once said, what the city council has focused on is how do you change that number from year to year? And there's a portion of the council's adopted financial policy that says we look back 5 years
Right.
and the growth in fixed assets, which is a rough approximation of the growth in plant upon which your property tax would have been levied, determines whether, to what degree that transfer should go up. And that's done every 2 years and incorporated as a cost of operation for the utility when the biennial rate study is conducted.
Yep.
And as a matter of council policy, that number never goes down. And the reason why it never goes down is because if it did go down, you'd have to find a replacement for that revenue.
and it just, the council policy that was just adopted 2 years ago did not have the benefit of any of this that we're going through now. And I would assume council is going to learn a great deal through this process.
I think what people outside of this group need to understand is that a change in one number is going to require a change in the other. It's not something. It's not just a decision arbitrarily made, but it is entirely up to the city council what that transfer level should be. And if you're looking at other municipal electrics, we're in the upper quartile.
There's several things going on here. One is you expressed to us the percentage of the transfer in a percentage of sales.
Right.
The transfer is in fact, that number is not based on any sales. My
That's
understanding
correct.
is that the calculation is based on assets.
That's correct.
I think we need to true this. We've got to, we say one thing and then we say something else.
Right.
I think
The
we can
reason-
make this clearer and more concise.
There are two reasons why we use, first of all, again, it's a theory or a concept. It's not, I think we'd be not using our time well doing a really refined comparison of what these numbers are compared to anybody else, including private utilities. The concept is it should represent taxes and return on equity. Having stated that, if we're comparing ourselves with other utilities, the percent of sales is what's universally used. That's why we use that number.
But I think it ought to be fair to say, or at least expressed somewhere in a report or, wherever we're going to end up here, that in fact we are looking at a return on assets.
Right.
Which is a legitimate kind of an economic barometer indicator. And I certainly would like the rate consultants to kind of go behind us and see where we are, and I'm sure they will. The other thing I want to point out is this. While there are local taxes that would be charged to an investor-owned utility if one existed in this town, I think you've got to be very careful to understand, and you and I have talked about this a little, touched on this. You got to be very careful to understand that IOU is not going to have an engineering, particularly have an engineering staff. They're not going to collect their bills in Danville. They're not going to have customer service in Danville. And Danville Power and Light should be given some credit as a going business in Danville. And if the taxpayers, if the city of Danville didn't own this business, their jobs and there's economic activity that would not occur in Danville. And those tax dollars wouldn't be there either. I mean, there's a lot of tax dollars that we may presume an IOU would pay because that is based in Danville now. But I don't think we can presume that every activity that goes on at Danville Power and Light is going to go on with the IOU if they owned it. And I think we should somehow think about that. And I'm not unhappy that we've got an inflator. The way that asset percentage was set up to take into account the increase in assets, it gave the general fund a cost of living increase, if you will. You have to assume that assets are going to go up every year. So to me, I believe that's pretty much in place, and that's certainly, you want to have some kind of certainty about your income from the utility. But I'm very much concerned that we've got this number locked in good. Well, and I want to make sure that our rate folks from Michigan take a look at this and make sure that we are not overshooting this contribution. I don't have a problem with it being fair, but I think if this is what we're going to do, let's make sure we got it as close to right as we can, and we can all sort of agree that it's a good number. And I'm just talking about the transfer part. Right. Now we'll go on to the other part.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
I'd like to look at cost allocation. So this is labeled general fund administrative fees. All right, because the utilities are a department of the city, they are afforded services from a variety of functions, including our office, city attorney, finance, information technology, human resources, and others. And were our utility a freestanding independent utility like a co-op, it would have to have all of those functions to some degree, either as part of its organization or contracted out. So the approach we've used for many years has been to allocate a share of those costs to each utility, and we're focusing here again on the electric fund. And we use an outside consultant to do this study and refresh it on a regular basis, and it uses logical means of allocating costs. So for human resource related activities, it looks at the total city employment and what portion is employed in the Power and Light Division, divides the human resources functions, and it includes all the fringe benefits that are paid to employees in that case, and just takes a proportionate share based on the Power and Light employment compared to the total. So what you see in the chart there are the annual amounts paid by fiscal year, actual 2010 through 2013, and the projected in 2014. And you can see that the electric fund pays a total of a little over $2 million for all of those shared functions. And again, looking at what impact that would have if we did away with those cost-sharing amounts, that would add another 9.5 cents to the tax rate, unless you could reduce proportionally those costs. And basically what the general fund is doing is achieving some economies of scale in many cases. If we did away with the electric operation, I'm hard pressed to say we could cut a significant amount out of the city attorney's office, city manager's office, finance, and HR to account for those employees. So this is an economy of scale that the general fund is enjoying by providing these benefits, and this is done in accordance with federal regulations for cost allocations for federal grants. So any questions on that?
So what you're saying, if we didn't have a utility department, we wouldn't save that amount of money though?
We'd save some, but certainly not that amount.
Can I go back for just 1 second?
Sure.
In July,
Right.
did we, city council, not transfer a couple of $1 million from our fund balance to cover consumption charges to the utilities?
No, it was all within the electric fund.
It was from the electric
Right.
fund, unrestricted fund.
Right.
We talked about it, but we didn't.
We talked about it, but we didn't do it. Okay.
So to say this another way, if Danville Power and Light did not exist, was not owned by the city of Danville, you as a city manager would have to think about, consider stripping out $2 million from your operating budget to general fund.
Right.
I'm not saying you do it, but you certainly have, it's going to be on the top of your list of things to do one day. I mean, if that day came.
That's correct.
And that's $2 million of, in some cases, some job head count,
Right.
some benefits for some local people. I just wanted to get that in.
If I could ask a question, in your APPA survey,
Yes.
are those numbers that are reported exclusive of cost allocations?
Yes.
Thank
This
you.
is over and above the transfers.
Let me ask that again.
Yes.
In the APPA reporting, is that the numbers that are reported to the APPA, is there any possibility that that would include costs to pay for allocations of overhead costs in the city government?
They don't break that out, so it is quite possible that among the utilities they surveyed, it is quite possible that you'll find utilities that don't allocate costs as we do, and recover that, attempt to recover that in the transfer. So it could very well be, and the APPA doesn't report that,
Thank you.
that some utilities do not have cost allocations like we do.
Thank you.
Is that, okay. The third group is labeled Special Project Financing by the Electric Fund. And this covers a 10-year period. And this is perhaps the most irritating to the Utility Commission. Is that fair to say?
And certain council members.
Because of the availability of cash in the utility funds, that's not to say that cash can be used for very appropriate utility purposes, but the availability of cash in the utility funds has made it possible for the city to make use of those funds to finance special projects, and the ones that have been done in the last 10 years are reflected here. So in 2013, there was a substantial investment by the Electric Fund in purchasing the ERP. Those of you that deal with software applications for companies or organizations know the Enterprise Resource Planning title covers the basic financial system for the city. So it covers everything from the accounting, payroll, accounts payable, receivable, all the reporting functions. And the city in 2003 put in a new ERP system, and $2.3 million of Electric Fund cash was used to help finance that. Also, $400,000 of Water Fund revenue. And I think, to be candid, there's no basis for that other than availability of cash. I can't see any documentation anywhere that went through some sort of process to determine how can we justify making those kind of payments. Certainly, the Electric Fund, Water Fund, as well as the other funds would have benefited from this software, but that could have been reflected in cost allocations over time or other means. Then in 2012 and 2013, contributions or investments in economic development projects were made from utility reserves. In 2012, $3 million, $1 million each from the Electric, Water, and Gas Fund, and in 2013, $3 million. So this is above and beyond the transfers or the cost allocations and the direct investments the various utilities made in serving industrial parks, all of the industrial parks, putting the infrastructure in, and in serving individual customers like IKEA in the Cane Creek Center. Over and above that, these transfers were made from utility cash into various projects. There were no funds, such projects last year, this year, and none are anticipated next year. Fred.
This is where I was going with the previous question about unrestricted fund balance. You said that these transfers were made because of the availability of cash in the fund. Isn't that the same fund that the excess surplus goes into every year? At the end of each year, the Electric Fund generally has a surplus.
They do.
Which goes into the same fund that was used to fund these projects. Is that, it's
No,
not unrestricted
without-
fund balance?
No, it's retained in the unreserved fund balance of the Electric Fund in this case,
That's what I was asking.
until the city council appropriates money into the,
Exactly what I was asking.
Right.
Exactly what I was asking. Thank you.
So we aren't assuming that from '03 to '12, there were not any transfers? It was just, wasn't any major ones?
From '03 to '12, there were none,
Were none?
but there were substantial investments in industrial parks. And any industry that came in, the utilities would have invested in getting infrastructure to that customer.
Well, that's not,
So-
that's not the same thing.
That's right.
Danville Power and Light is in the business of providing power.
Right.
It was part of their business,
Part of the capital outlay.
which was to go and put in infrastructure so they could deliver the product to the customer, as opposed to having a transfer of money to another entity that was going to spend that money.
So in the
I mean,
case.
if you're serving your customers, that's your job.
Right.
So they're
Right.
kind of two different things, being in business and then being a party to some financial
Right.
engineering.
Although it's not my intent to complicate things, but in IKEA's case, we went in and constructed a dedicated substation to serve IKEA. It turned out that was not needed. So for several years, we're paying, in effect, the mortgage on a piece of infrastructure. That cost about $4 million.
Right.
So the electric fund was making substantial investments, and they were directly related to a customer. Not every one of those cases was their
Right.
revenue that was available to pay that investment off in the projected time period. So the utilities have made investments in every single industrial park, plus the Coleman Marketplace. A substantial amount of investment was made there. And in addition to the overall complex or industrial park, every customer in that park was, there was a investment of some degree by the respective utilities. So what I've described today is over and above any of those investments.
But, clarification, Joe, was the money spent in the electric fund, or was it transferred to the general fund and spent?
Matter transferred to the general fund and spent.
In all cases,
In the
03?
ones I've shown here, yes.
Pardon?
Yes,
Those
in
are
the ones
listed
I've
here.
shown here, yes.
And we would
Yeah,
just
I think
hope
we need to know
that,
those figures.
we would just hope that we're going to get a return on that investment. I'm sure that the investments were made, assuming that there would be a return
Right.
to the city.
And, directly to the utilities as well. But it is an extraordinary thing. When you look at private investment or privately owned utilities, you see a lot of economic development activity, but most of it is assisting in marketing, providing technical assistance, very little of what we see here. So this is unique compared to other electric operations.
What's unique?
The
type of
contributions
investment.
that
The
I
direct
just described.
contribution.
Right.
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 The,
Yeah.
we we've encountered some struggles in the last several years. We've got stranded costs, we've got congestion charges, we've had some large debts that have cropped up in the last few years. And it seems that if Danville Power and Light had not had this $4 million available to it in its unrestricted reserve, its savings account, if you will, it would have been easier to have overcome some of these congestion charges and stranded costs, and some of these one-time payments that we had to make. And maybe we wouldn't be in a situation where we are now with the rate increase that we have already had and the rate increase that's probably to come. My point is, if Danville Power and Light had been left to run its business and had a reserve that was able to overcome some of these emergency difficulties like the congestion charge and the stranded cost charge, which I believe we knew was coming, and to some extent we planned for. I mean, we set $3 million aside for that. So if we had had this money available in that reserve, then I don't believe we would have faced such the kinds of rate increases that we've had and that we sort of anticipate we're going to have. And we may have smoothed that out over a longer period of time. You know, 2 weeks ago we talked about how we did our rate increases. We did them immediately. We knew what our long-term shortfall was, our deficit was, and we have instituted those rate increases. Whereas Appalachian, on the other hand, has got an IOU, or regulated. They've got to go to the State Corporation Commission and get their money. And a lot of large electric utilities in this country, they use debt on a regular basis. They borrow money and they time out their borrowings, their dividend policies, they're paying their owners, their ability to pay their bills off. That's the way they do it. Dan LaPlante was put in a position with $4 million that went to the general fund, and you all weren't going to borrow any money because we couldn't do that on the utility commission.
But you are suggesting, are you suggesting that a larger unrestricted fund balance would have kept the rates down?
I am suggesting that there would have been $4 million in the unrestricted fund balance before we had our stranded costs crystallize on the AMP project, which was what, I don't know, how much was it? 5 million? 5.6 million, and the congestion charge of 4.8 in January. That is what's that? $11 million of debt we got to pay back obligations that have hit Danville Power & Light since the first of this calendar year. And certainly if we'd have had that $4 million, that's $4 million we would have had. And a prudent business probably would have had some cash in the bank to take care of these kind of emergencies. That's just my opinion. And I think it's something that we ought to discuss and it ought to be thought about.
What's the unrestricted fund balance? I guess I'm saying is that we still have a pretty good balance, unrestricted fund balance.
Who's we? The city council?
City or utilities?
No,
city council.
What is our unrestricted fund balance?
Do that.
Yeah, it's maintained by council policy, and it's roughly 22%,
Yeah, okay.
and it's meant to cover 180 days of operations and debt service, so it's substantial.
But that's exactly why you don't draw down the fund balance to the limit.
So it says 26 million, basically.
It's 25% of, it's 1/4 of your power cost, all your expenses, and your transfer from the general fund.
Well, I guess
that's
the question is, if we had 26 million and we kept that 4 million, had 30 million, would we have used part of that fund balance to pay off those? If we would have, why didn't we use part of 26 million?
Because that's the minimum. That has to be there all the time. And one of the big reasons why that has to be there all the time
Wait a minute,
is because of the bond.
What's the minimum?
We got to keep so many days of operating money as well as pay off our debt as well. So I don't have those
It's-
exact days.
Yeah, it equates to about 22 or 23%.
Yeah, 23% of our revenue.
And that money would be used.
So
if there-
we're looking at roughly $20 million.
22.
22 million, and we got 26 million. So why didn't we use that?
I don't have anything else to say. I told you what I know, and that's what I know. And we've been told at utility commission meetings that we were at, and that's the way it's been for several years. So.
One more question.
Okay.
Can I have a follow-up question for Joe?
Please, sir.
You mentioned IKEA, we overbuilt capacity for them. Is that because we built that based on their expansion and their 720 employees with an extra plant,
Yes,
which hasn't come to pass?
right.
But if it does come to pass, we'll have the capacity.
We're well positioned.
Thank you.
You just had half a stranded asset for 8 years,
All right.
plus a railroad siding.
Plus a railroad side, yes.
I never forget about the railroad
I
siding.
don't know. Okay.
You finished, Mr.
Yes.
Casey? Does anybody else have anything else? Jason?
I was going to go over the power cost adjustment from 2010. Item
All right.
number 6.
Excuse me?
Item number 6.
Come ahead.
Thank you.
We're flipping to the presentation that was made in 2010 from our rate consultant then. Basically, we had 3 options. We were going on many assumptions then. Power was forecasted to be lower than what it actually was. We had 3 strategies in place. One was to do nothing and just fluctuate the cost of power through our PCA. The second strategy was to do a gradual decline. And then the third option was to level costs, basically flatten out our PCA, which City Council did approve in July 2010. And that strategy was implemented for up until December 31st of 2013. This was a long-term strategy based on several assumptions, one being that Prairie State was to come online in 2012, and it did not come online until a year later. And then it didn't come on at the forecasted rates that were predicted. Unit 2 then came on later as well. So basically Prairie State was delayed, the coal plant in Illinois that were used to make these assumptions, which is a good portion of our baseload power. We received 50 megawatts of power from Prairie State, and then the power when it came online, it was higher than forecasted because the plant was having some operational problems to get online. That's basically all I wanted to talk about there, and just remind you of things that we put in place because of the PCA. And the PCA was stable for almost 4 years, from July of 2010 up until February of this year, of 0.016. During that time, we also implemented an energy efficiency fund, which has been very good for the utility. Yes.
I have a couple questions, but sometimes I just feel the need to say something. I was opposed to the low rate that was set here, and I was opposed to it at the utility commission level, and I was opposed to it at city council level, because I know power plants don't ever come in on budget or on schedule. Having said that, I'm curious why either when we saw these numbers not coming in during this period of 3 years, why didn't Danville Utility Commission get told about the urgency of this issue from the consultant or from the staff or from both? I'm surprised. When we got hit, these are numbers that Danville Utility gets every month. But somehow it was never emphasized during the monthly meetings. And then we had consultant meetings, and it was never an issue that I remember coming up. How did we get in the situation we did after 3 years, instead of somewhere figuring out we needed to change course?
I completely understand your question. In hindsight, we could have said we would have done something differently, and personally, I would have dropped the strategy. As soon as Prairie State, they said it would have been in a year later, the strategy should have been forfeited, and we looked at current cost.
And I know you're not the person to be put in this position, but it seems to me like we need to know what happened. That's the important thing about history. Is history teaches us about the future.
That's right.
And I just don't know, this ended up, the power cost adjustment took a big hit here because of this. And it was adopted by City Council, it was recommended by the Utility Commission, but something didn't work. And I just hope we learn from that. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just was, when I sat in on I was observer for utility meeting, I was really skeptical of this, and I remember even bringing it up. If you keep rates low for a long time, and suddenly you raise them a year or two later, people don't remember they were low. They just remember their rates went up. And so often it's better just to keep them up here and raise a little bit than to keep them down here and raise a lot. And that's exactly what happened. So I was opposed to it too when it got to council, but it just didn't seem like a good strategy. But our consultants told us this was the strategy to take.
That's right.
Well, and it's just interesting to me, if you look at the retail cost of power supply back then, which was 0.071 per kilowatt hour. That's on slide 15 of the handout that you gave us. Retail cost of power supply. The slide number's in the lower right-hand corner. So when that power cost stabilization number was put together, the anticipated retail cost of power supply was 0.071, 0.078, 084 per kilowatt hour of sales. And we're at what today?
Repeat what you said. I was
The
flipping.
retail cost of power supply in this slide was 0.07084. And what we're charging today is
12.4.
Now, that's
That's
the
not-
retail cost, our power cost,
our
Our
power
power
cost is 0.084,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, our total costs are 12.4.
Yep. So we're at 0.084 now, right?
So it's about one.
So it was a 20% miss. It was a pretty large miss. And then, of course, on top, so now we're in a position of just having to recover that. Plus this stranded and congestion debacle. It happens. It was a mistake.
Yep.
We just, as you said, need to make sure that we
Learn from our mistakes.
learn from our
Well, certainly
mistakes. Don't
from
do
going
that
back to
again.
what Fred just said, this is history, and
Yes,
you
you
need
have
to
to learn.
pause it. You need to think a little about, if you're going to have a long-term strategy like this, you certainly want to make sure that you're monitoring it closely and you have an understanding when you start down the road what the dark clouds are going to look like, and kind of have an idea that if what can go wrong, and when you see it going wrong, adjust. And I hope that's what we learned from this. Because it was an ambitious plan. I'll say that. I saw the value of it, but certainly we were seeing that it was not progressing. And, but I mean, we did our due diligence. We talked about it every month, I believe. I mean, we talked about that power cost adjustment. And is it looking right? Is it the right time? Should it be going up this time of the year? It ebbed and flowed with seasonality, but then all of a sudden it just went haywire.
Yep.
That's my apology.
Just
Anything else?
Just a couple comments. The congestion costs have been paid for this year. We paid for those over a 6-month period. and the stranded costs are being paid for over a 5-year period.
That was in the rate, that was included in the most recent rate adjustment,
Right.
where we zeroed out the power cost adjustment.
Right.
Just, it may not be germane to the subject, but perhaps it is. When we look at our gas business, we have a
PGA.
PGA. Have we ever had a similar policy of freezing the PGA?
No.
I didn't think so. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Can you go back, I want to come back, did you say that we were going to pay for the
6 months.
stranded cost in 5 years?
In 5 years.
And that's what's included in, that's what's embedded in the rate right now?
It's embedded in the new rate structure and will be embedded in the next rate study as well.
So it's in the adjustment that's already been made to the rate, that's in there, and it's a 5-year period.
Right.
So in 60 months, that's going to go away.
So
That part will have been paid for.
2019, yeah,
Okay, and it will have been paid for. I appreciate it.
if not sooner.
I think I've asked that question before. I never quite understood how
And in
that
that case, we
works.
have upside, but no downside because of the current litigation?
Yeah, I mean, just an update on litigation, the case was supposed to be held between the two parties in December, has been postponed, and the case has been certified to the Ohio State Supreme Court. So that's a good sign for AMP, and good things could come out of that, so
Again, we have upside, not so much downside.
that's right.
Okay, So we're conservative in what we're doing right now from a rate
Very
recovery.
conservative.
Good.
Fred?
The power cost adjustment that's taking care of that stranded cost also took into...
Taking care of the congestion. We've taken care of the congestion.
So the stranded cost, we've got, Philip Smith had recommended Utility Commission include $3 million a couple of years ago in the
Right.
budget. Is that all the budgeted amount that we've
That
got?
money's still being held and reserved.
But that's the $3 million.
That's $3 million.
But that's all we have right now set aside for the stranded cost.
Right.
Anybody else? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. King, do you have anything you want to say?
No, I think at the next meeting, we'll have a representative from AMP.
Okay.
John Bentine, Senior Vice President of AMP here, to talk about AMP and what AMP does for Danville and some of their projects they have coming in the future.
When are the home front people going to show? When are they going to start?
December.
Any comments from the public? Oh, Lord. Let me start right here with Mr. Turpin. Mr. Turpin is a member of the Utility Commission.
I'm not going to lose an opportunity to ask a question, Philip.
Yes, sir.
I've got a lot of questions, and I don't want to belabor the time here, but it is right confusing to understand what it costs to get our power here. And especially through the PJM area and all the variables. I think it would be helpful if we could have a breakdown of all of our sources of electricity, what it costs to generating point, then what it costs to get it here through the various regions. And if we don't know those costs and it's variable, which I gather it is, that should be noted, at least have a range so we have a better understanding of all the variables to get it here. It sounds like we're never really going to know for sure what it's going to cost to get it here. And I think it'd be helpful if we had that broke out a little better. That'd help me to understand it better. That's all I had. I went away. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob, did you have something you wanted to say? Bob Shaughnessy is also a member of the Utility Commission.
Well, mostly I'd like to get some clarification and understand something a little bit more with PJM situation, because before, as I understand it, before the electric deregulation in the country, or Virginia, I mean, some of the states, I don't know, maybe there's even some states that never deregulated. I'm not sure. But, you know, a lot of the states went in different directions. And as I understand, here in Virginia, the investor-owned utilities, they own both transmission lines and the generators. And it was decided that they would unbundle the transmission lines and keep the generators. And when they did that, the SCC allowed them to temporarily increase prices in order to reimburse them for the transmission lines. And so they were paid back for them. And then the transmission lines were transferred to, well, in our case, to PJM. If I'm saying it right, I don't know. If I'm saying it wrong, correct me. Okay, so now PJM owns them, and evidently they're able to charge different fees for transmission, for congestion, etc. What is their responsibility to us? Do they have a responsibility to reduce congestion in the future? Can we depend on them to help us out in that situation in the future? Or are we still at the same mercy we have been past in January, let's say?
PJM's responsibility is they do not own assets. They do not own transmission or generation.
Who owns those?
In our case, AEP does.
AEP
And
still owns them, but I thought they had to unbundle them.
PJM's sole responsibility is to meet generation to load economically and to dispatch those resources.
So any new transmission lines that are built are going to be built by the utilities?
Right.
Okay, I was confused. I was thinking it's different. So I thought that, what did deregulation actually do then to the utilities?
It took the responsibility of dispatching generation and put it into one entity, the RTOs.
Yeah, but what about all the unbundling that they did?
It set up what used to be single corporations that own generation, transmission, distribution. It set those up into individual companies.
Okay.
What benefit that had to the consumer, I can't say, but theoretically, it was to provide a more open market for utility, eventually consumers, right down to residential consumers, to buy their power from different sources.
Okay.
But it hasn't worked out in that beneficial way in Virginia.
So right now, the PJM we don't know what their responsibility to eliminating these congestion charges in the future. Do they have nothing they're responsible for, or do they have a responsibility?
We could ask AMP that next month if more restrictions are going to be put on place because we pay capacity charges to PJM and for these generators to be in place during these peak times, the times we need power.
Right.
So we expect power to be delivered to Danville during these times. So we need to make sure that there are restrictions in place that make sure that we have power delivered at the cost that we expect.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you, Bob. Brett Vesey. Brett Vesey's with the Virginia Manufacturers Association.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
I just want to contribute a couple of pieces of information as you deliberate, and thank you very much for taking the time to do this and do it with urgency. As you know, every month that goes by, these companies are trying to figure out how to control their cost, how to be a team player, how to help grow the economy. So we're with you. We want to be able to be cooperative. We want to help to find a solution. We realize it doesn't happen overnight, so thank you. But there are a couple of things that I heard today that I thought I'd share some information that will help you. Number one, we do realize it's a tube of jelly. You have a large, probably one of the largest contributions to a general fund out of your electric utility in the state. So we do realize that you're going to have to come up with those costs somewhere else. However, the reality of industrial production is, and the large commercial is, you have to be competitive. So at the end of the day, no matter what the decision is, you have to look at that rate and whether or not it is truly competitive for these companies to operate successfully here. When it comes to the tax issue, you should be aware that the city of Danville has one of the highest tax rates for industrial businesses. You have 72 cents per hundred on machinery and tools. It's not even close with the two other jurisdictions that you serve, that being Pittsylvania County and Halifax. So those are two things to be very conscious of, is the property tax and the machinery and tools tax, which is what manufacturers live and die by. You are not among the lowest tax. The other thing to be aware of as you make these deliberations and you have this middle ground you have to play is there is one other factor, because you are a unique utility in that you serve 3 jurisdictions. The Supreme Court has said pretty clearly, and I encourage you to take a look at those court cases, I'll send a brief, that you can charge the additional costs to go to the general fund. It needs to be called a tax. You have to have a majority of your city council vote on it, and you do. So therefore, no matter what you call it, it's still a tax, and it is allowable. However, the Supreme Court in the Fairfax County Water Authority versus the City of Falls Church case said very, very clearly, you cannot charge that tax to the jurisdictions that are not within the city of Danville. That is called an extraterritorial taxation issue, and you have some challenges you need to address as you deal with this with the companies that are paying that overhead in Pennsylvania and Halifax. It doesn't help your City of Danville companies, but you do have to deal with that, and it deals with the issue of being captive and not having a vote in the decision. These folks are not represented by you members that are city council members. So that's a very fine point, but we wanted you to be aware that you do have a little eccentricity in this. We'll be glad to help in any part of this and working with the other companies that are involved as we go forward, and you certainly will have one of the members of our team at each one of these meetings, and if you need any information from us, we're available. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, sir. Anyone else from the public? Does anyone have anything they'd like to say as we close today's meeting? Thank you very much for a vigorous and open discussion.
Appreciate the presentation. We're good.
Thank you all very much.
Very well prepared.